Well, good morning, friends, and welcome. My name is Will Ed Green. I'm an associate pastor here at Foundry, and I'm the director of discipleship. On behalf of all of our pastors and staff here at Foundry United Methodist Church, I'm so glad to welcome you to our second annual Kirk Symposium Masterclass. I have a couple of housekeeping items to share with you this morning as we gather ourselves in, and then I'll share a little bit more information about the symposium before we begin. You'll find that throughout the space today, we're asking everybody to wear your mask unless you're actively eating or drinking or speaking at a microphone. When you come up for questions and answers later, you'll be asked to take your mask off if you're comfortable so that we can hear you clearly. If you're joining us online, there will be an option for you to share questions in the chat, so make sure you've got that pulled up so that you can participate in that way a little bit later. You'll find on your tables or in the email that was sent yesterday an article that we'll be engaging a little bit later, so I encourage you to find that now and go ahead and make sure you've got that in front of you for later on in our time. If you're joining us online, go ahead and pull that up too. Feel free to move throughout the space today as you need to. There is, of course, food and beverage at the back if you would like to fortify yourself throughout our time together today. There are also restrooms just out these back double doors and to the right, if and as you need them. A little bit more about the Kirk Symposium class and why we do this thing that we do here at Foundry. Dr. William Astor and Kirk and his wife, Vivian Kirk, were longtime advocates for justice and inclusion in all areas of life. Dr. Kirk was the first African American to graduate with a doctorate in political science from the University of Texas after a long struggle that he and others engaged in to help integrate higher education. He was later appointed to the Office of Economic Opportunity by Lyndon Baines Johnson and served in the Johnson administration, the Nixon, Carter, and Reagan administrations doing that work. In addition to his efforts on behalf of racial inclusion and advocacy, Dr. Kirk was a longtime advocate for racial integration and ending segregation in the Methodist Church. Through his efforts, the church was integrated fully in 1968 as part of the merger between the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church. This class, this series, was created to honor his memory and legacy and that of his wife as we continue to create a community that is truly being and becoming more radically inclusive, anti-racist, and anti-colonial. Some of you were able to join us for our lecture last November. We're glad that you're joining us again today. If you're joining us for the first time, we're glad to welcome today Dr. George Derek Musgrove and Dr. Chris Myers-Ash. Drs. Musgrove and Ash are the authors of Chocolate City, a book that we've been studying together both here at Foundry and with our partners at the Adlavich DC Jewish Community Center. We're glad that you're with us today. That's all the business that I have to share. And so now we get to do what we came here to do, which is to receive the gifts of Dr. Musgrove and Dr. Ash. Thank you for being with us today.
How much he loves his neighborhood of Washington Heights, and he's singing, oh, you know, I found my island, I've been on it this whole time, I'm home, right? And saying, you know, with the great music. And it's funny, as I was walking into the airport, that's what I was thinking in my head. I was like, oh, I found my city, I'm home. Because for me, DC is home. It's always been home. And even if when I live in Maine, I used to live in Mississippi, you know, coming back here always feels like coming home. We're driving over here, Derek and I are driving, you know, past UDC, and we're telling, so like every street, every neighborhood has these layers of memories. And to me, that's what home is. And that's That's why I'm here today. That's why I keep jumping at the chance to come back and talk about Chocolate City, the book. It's why we wrote the book, because we love this city. We love this place and wanted to do it justice with a history. So I'll let Derek.
Thank you.
Explain why he's here.
And so good morning, everyone. And thanks again to Will Ed for arranging everything, to Eric and his crew for taking care of us technologically. What we're doing right now is just introducing ourselves and telling you sort of how we feel about the city and how we feel about this work. We're going to ask you all to introduce yourselves after that so we can get to know you all and some of the things you'd like to know about the city. And then we'll get into the sort of more formal aspect of the program. But, I got to say, as we were driving here this morning, Chris, I was actually thinking about how much of my love of the city is a product of a conversation I had with you approximately, my God, it must have been
We're old.
12 years ago. At UDC. I'm sure for those of you who attended our lecture in the sanctuary a couple of months ago, you know that Chris is a DC native. I grew up in Baltimore. I was born in New Haven, Connecticut. And so I am not a native Washingtonian, all one word. And I came here, though, because I love the city. I started coming here when I was in high school, and I just fell in love with the city. And then I decided that I was going to teach at UDC after I finished my doctorate because I wanted to be in the city and I wanted to stay here. But I still felt very much like an outsider. I would get to UDC and I would sort of look around and I would look at it as someone who was from the outside looking in. And then Chris came to campus and he sort of pulled me into this project of writing about DC. And even though I had already taught the DC history course, I had already known a good bit of DC history, the process of doing the book with Chris, who had this real investment in the city, this desire to defend his city against those who said it had no history, which was infectious, right? By doing that with Chris, I came to just sort of absorb the city and driving around and saying, well, what did it look like to the Nakostan when before contact with John Smith and the other Virginia settlers? What did this landscape look like to Black Power activists when the city had a different built environment, had different demographics, had a different relationship with Congress, and constantly imagining and reimagining the city, and then trying to understand how much of what I see around me was not here, or simply wouldn't come into someone's consciousness. And it was that really exciting process that I think made me a great deal more of a Washingtonian than I had been before I met Chris. And so thank you for that a couple of years back. What we'd like to do really quickly before we get into the discussion, though, is find out who you all are and what you would like to get out of this conversation and what you would like to know about DC history by the time you head out of here around 12:30 or so. And so we know we have a bunch of people online. We also have approximately 15 to 20 of you in here. And we can't do everyone just because of the time, but we would love to just get a sampling of roughly 5 people on this side, maybe 4 people on this side, and then if it's possible, some of the folks online to introduce themselves and just state one thing that they're really curious about when it comes to DC history, or one thing that they would like to get out of the discussion today. And so I'm not going to call on folks. Would folks just like to volunteer? So we'll sort of start here and loop around, but anyone who would like to start at this first table, and then we'll go from there.
Go
Please.
ahead.
Yes.
We can bring the
that
mic
might
to
be
you.
best for the folks at home.
Yeah.
Oh, good Lord. There it goes. Thank you.
I'm Barbara Cambridge. I've been a member of Foundry since the late 1990s. I came to Washington thinking I was staying 2 years because I was working with the American Association for Higher Education. And then I upped for 2 more, and 2 more, and 2 more. And I fell in love with the city also, and what the possibilities were to be an advocate for higher education in this setting. The other reason I wanted to stay was Foundry United Methodist Church. I fell in love with this church on the first Sunday I came here and have been active and benefited so much from this church. And one of the things I benefited lately from is the Chocolate City discussion group that I was in. We had people from Asbury and people from Foundry, and we were very honest with each other. We had some disagreement, in fact, but that was actually good because we could see other points of view. So I got a lot out of the history and had a lot of questions evoked that I thought were ones I probably wouldn't have thought to ask before that. So I appreciated that very much. I'm quite interested now in where DC is currently, and can we keep from doing what happened in this book so often, where we make progress and then whoop, down and up again? What are the strategies for helping to keep the upward motion going? And so that's one of my questions today.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Ann Brown Burkell. I've been a member of Foundry since the late 80s, and I've lived in Washington now 36 years, which is longer than I've lived anywhere else. It's been a progression northward. I was born on the Gulf Coast in Alabama in 1952 and grew up very much in the heart of the civil rights movement. I came to Virginia for college and law school, then went back south again to New Orleans for 9 years, and I moved here and at a time when Washington was in a good deal of turmoil, but reading this book, it's hard to tell if it was ever a time when Washington wasn't in turmoil for one reason or another. I'm struggling a little bit with specific questions, but I would say the topics that interest me most and interested me most in studying the book, and a great group that happened to be all Foundry that Cassandra led for us, and my wonderful friend Ralph was part of, and I'm very grateful that we had one black member of the group who was wonderfully willing to share his perspective as a longtime resident. Maybe he'll tell you about that. But the topics that have always interested me most are housing. It's something I've had a long interest in and some personal history with in other places, and the complexities of housing and how that shapes so much of what happens with race and racism, education as well, and just the political struggle of Washington. I've held a theory for a long time, now I don't know that that's true, that Washington was so held back in its governance that it has struggled to develop a cadre of effective politicians. And I think maybe that's a misjudgment on my part, but I mean, you know, our political, our functioning as a government is so complex because we need to be a state, but we're also a city, and we have to administer so many things in that regard. But anyway, I've said too much. But
Thank you. Please.
I'm Peg Simpson, and have been at Foundry since 1971. And at one point early on, I was head of something called Uplift House, which was a group sponsored by 6 neighborhood churches: 15th Street, St. Thomas, First Baptist, Foundry, Luther Place, I think. And it was, it had Vista volunteers, and it basically was doing Band-Aids, you know, I think. And I think that the discussions around the Chocolate City, you know, I think the book is fabulous, but I think the discussion groups around it and the honesty that we were able to have, because it was a small group. The one I was in had 3 people from Asbury in it and 4 or 5 people from Foundry. And that I really hope we can build on that and build strong relationships in talking to each other and also as a church. The question I have, which building on what y'all had done last fall, it's become even more of a political issue of let's don't talk about anything that's sensitive. And there's so many fabulous books out in addition to y'all's that really are digging into the history and providing conversation. But I'd like to know what y'all think about that horrible trend of getting rid of sticky conversations, including especially race.
Right. Yes. divisive topics, right? That's the new word. We can't talk about divisive topics. It's illegal in some states now. It's really
Would you like
frightening. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amelia. I've been at Foundry for, I guess, over 10 years now. And I've been in DC. I moved here in 2000 from New York City, but I also grew up in Baltimore. We met at your lecture in November. And I've been involved, well, I grew up in Baltimore in the 70s. I'm dating myself, but when there was a lot of, there were riots related to racial inequity in Baltimore in the mid-70s, which I know that was before your time, but you may know that. And I've been involved in racial justice issues for quite a long time. And it's a strong interest of mine. I really, I enjoyed the book. I wasn't able to participate in all of the discussions, but some of what you touched on in your talk in November, not only housing, but as you know, the racial inequity housing is a good example, but it extends throughout, transportation, so much, it's all related. Income inequality, it's throughout our society. And in DC, I do agree with you on the government, and I think you did touch on that in your lecture in November. So I'd like to hear some more about some of those issues, which I'm sure you'll probably get into. Just building on, these are long-standing issues, so what more, they're huge issues. What more can we try to do? Where can we fit in terms of resolving or helping to resolve?
Great questions. Great questions.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're gonna move a little bit more quickly this way, just so we don't. Pardon me. Anyone from these two tables? Okay, perfect.
Hello, I'm Liz. I'm a noob in DC, so I moved here coming up on 3 years ago. And I really enjoyed the discussion. I enjoyed the book. And since moving here, I've been really interested in learning about DC generally, DC history, the people from here, like a biography of the history of the city, I mean. And so I was reading things like Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, which was great. Reading the kind of autobiography memoir of Katharine Graham at Washington Post, and the history of the kind of investigative journalism story of how the Watergate news was like broke. And so Chocolate City was another nice kind of addition to that kind of thing. So I've just been enjoying that, and I guess my questions here and what I'm interested to hear about are, what lessons we're learning from all of these things about knowing the people here, knowing the city, and how broadly they apply. Like, do they apply specifically to DC? I mean, a lot of the case studies might, but how much can the lessons that we learn from DC apply to the rest of the country and to communities all over the place? And what next I should read. So I'm real into the recommendations of others on that front.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Paula Blair. I came in '94 to this city and have really enjoyed the readings and the discussions with our group. I think the thing that I've been contemplating, and it's kind of dovetails with what I think Barbara asked and a little bit with Ann, there were organizational structures that people fit into to advocate for whatever they thought was important. We mentioned Marion Barry with Pride. I'd never heard of Pride. SNCC was still in the background. SCLC was still an established organization. You had people like Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was making her way, Walter Fauntleroy. You had names were mentioned that I remember from the 70s and the 80s that were shapers And I don't understand the new genre of organizations that are led by younger people. I don't fit into, but I know that there needs to be structural organizations to keep things going once the highlight activity or the tipping point happens. And I think that to keep progress going, you got to have that grassroots grounding. How do we establish that? You know, Adrian Fenty came in, he left. He didn't leave an organization, so to speak. Vincent Gray came, left. Muriel Bowser, I don't see it, and this isn't a criticism. I'm just looking for starting that. Anthony Williams was the one that the book really talked about, laying the structure for growing the city, growing the revenue. And we're seeing the fruition of this with gentrification and the way the city has grown. So structurally, what's missing? What do we need to put in place so that we can keep the momentum and not digress to the extent that other places have?
Thank you.
My name is Ralph Williams. I've been attending Foundry since 1973, which is when I moved to DC in 1972 after I finished college. My question or concern is something I think was missing from your book for me, and that's been the role of the religious community in DC. And having attended Foundry for almost 50 years now, and knowing some of the history, the racial history of this congregation, I'm at a point of not seeing the problems of, the Congress and external forces, but seeing a lot of the problems, that they're problems related to us and who we are as people. Because I had to be a part of this church for like 20 years before I realized that it was in fact a part of the racial history of DC, and how unpleasant even our history is. And I'm concerned about what the broader religious community, the positive role that they might have in making a change about where they come from and where they stand and what they're willing to do to make the necessary change happen.
And we can do, I think, one more. Is it possible to get someone from online? So Will Ed's going to bring someone in. Thank you.
Perfect. Here, I'll grab the...
I'm sorry.
So just sharing on behalf of some folks who've commented in the chat, we have with us today Beth Scott, who is one of our discussion group leaders. Beth would love to learn more about how the geology and environment, soil, rivers, etc., have shaped the city and what and where is deemed desirable. So the space and how space, and particularly the environment, has shaped the work for racial equality and equity. Wendy S. is with us from one of our reading groups at the Adlavich JCC. And one of her group's questions is, the book starts out with how the city was wronged, but moves to how the city is now in the wrong. Is this a change in perception or the story? We're also joined today by Mike Lawson, who is interested in turning Chocolate City knowledge into action, particularly in the context of a large metropolitan area and multi-state region. And we're also joined today by Carol Travis, who is a member of our sibling congregation, Asbury United Methodist Church. She wants to know, as a native Washingtonian, because she knows and knew so many of the players, how we can help our children in not repeating the mistakes of the past as we move forward.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you all for doing that. That's actually really helpful for us, because again, what we're going to do this morning is give you sort of 3 vignettes into the city's history. We're going to sort of talk about specific moments that we think will communicate specific lessons that we can sort of chew over here as a group. And then we're going to open up some space at the end of our talk where we can just sort of freestyle and talk about anything that you all would like to. And so that gives us a baseline, what you just mentioned, for how we can make that transition to our sort of fourth session before we end this afternoon. So I'm going to kick things off and talk about history and the struggle for equality in the Chocolate City. And I'm going to do this with a sort of personal story of the summer of 2020. So I hope you all will bear with me on this. And the point of this story is I think it really explicates our approach to the study of history and its intersection with activism. And it also serves as sort of a framework for how we're approaching the study of history as a first step towards activism in this session, right? So we want to be very clear for you all, with you all, sort of what we think history can do and what we think history cannot do, right? And so let me just start off by saying that, sort of in the summer of 2020, and this is June, and so right when the protests kick off, I found myself drawn to Lincoln Park. Now, Lincoln Park is sort of my old neighborhood. I used to live on Capitol Hill, but I had moved uptown by then. But I found myself going back there constantly, not just to get out of my house because I was sort of bored out of my mind from the pandemic, but in fact because there were a large number of protests going on in Lincoln Park. So you all may remember that in the weeks after the murder of George Floyd, a large number of the activists who flooded into the streets, and these are sort of seasoned Black Lives Matter activists, but they're also literally millions and millions of people who had never participated in racial justice protests before. One of the things that they began doing in that month, that many people had been calling for years, but they really began doing physically in that month, is tearing down Confederate statues. And you could see them come down day after day, week after week. There was the Jefferson Davis statue in Richmond. I mean, people just hitched it to the back of a car and dragged it off its pedestal. It was fabulous, I have to say. But this was an international phenomenon. You had the Edward Colston statue in Bristol Harbor in the UK. And of course, here in DC, you had the Albert Pike statue, which few people know about. It's right near a highway entrance down by Judiciary Square. And Albert Pike is really being honored as a leader of the Masons. He was a very long-serving leader of the Masons, but he was also a Confederate general. And so when people got wind of that, his is the only Confederate statue within the confines of modern-day D.C. That's sort of a standalone bronze statue in that regard. And that was dragged from its pedestal by protesters that June as well. But then a problem arose for many of the protesters, right? And that is that there are no more Confederate statues in D.C. And folks are in the streets and folks are fired up, right? But there are no more. I mean, the only other one that's outside, and this is key, right? That's like out in the open air, is the massive Confederate memorial in the rear of Arlington Cemetery. And I don't know if any of you have seen it. There is a little Confederate memorial plot in the rear of Arlington Cemetery, which is bizarre because, of course, that's Robert E. Lee's old family plantation, the Custis family plantation. And huge numbers of Union soldiers were actually dumped into his rose garden as a way to keep him from being able to reclaim his property after the Civil War, right? And that was the original Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is literally on his front lawn, and then the cemetery grows up around it. But the United Daughters of the Confederacy petitioned for a Confederate plot in the rear of the cemetery. It not only has Confederate graves, which are different than the rounded Union graves, they're actually pointed, but there's also this massive, absolutely massive bronze statue in the back. Nobody was going to go tear that down, right? One, most people don't know about it, and two, it's on federal land and it's relatively well guarded, so it's not like you can just march in there with a couple thousand people in a car, right? And so folks really didn't have anything else to go after. And that was the case in a lot of other non-Southern cities as well. And so what people began doing is looking for statues that had any relationship to racism, white supremacy, and colonialism. And in a couple of cases, they made some really odd choices among these statues that they began to tear down as the month progressed. In San Francisco, people tore down a bust of Ulysses Grant, the great conquering general of the Union Army, but because he had owned, I think, a small number of slaves prior to the war. You also had the abolitionist, Hans Christian Haig, whose statue was pulled down in Madison. And here in DC, as people began looking for these statues, they went after the Andrew Jackson statue in front of the White House because he was, of course, the president who, lorded over Indian removal in the Southeast United States, and really wasn't the nicest guy overall, right? And federal officials stopped that. The people were literally in the process of trying to tear it down, and they were chased away by park police and many others. And so a small contingent of the folks who were looking for statues to tear down headed across town to Lincoln Park. And they fixed on the Emancipation Memorial. And if I get I was about to ask Eric to do it, but I, of course, have, and we messed this one up. We were supposed to have this when we were introducing ourselves. But they fixed on the Emancipation Memorial. This is a statue that was put up in 1876 to commemorate Lincoln, but also specifically his role as the great emancipator, a name that African Americans gave him after the Civil War. And it was the only statue paid for by freed African Americans, a large bronze statue erected in that century. And in fact, the first in the country. It was also one of the first to depict a full-bodied African American man in a bronze statue. And it was, for the entirety of the late 19th century, the national Lincoln statue for the United States of America. And so when people wanted to have Lincoln events, Lincoln commemorations, they would go to this statue erected by paid for by freed slaves. Now, for those of you who've seen it, and now it's all of you who have seen it, you can see that it's not the most flattering statue for African Americans. It is a product of a racist time, 1876 to be specific, a moment when Reconstruction is being overthrown across the South. And when casual notions of racial superiority among white Americans were the norm, not the exception. Even though it was paid for by freed slaves, it was in fact handled, all the planning and the actual execution, by a group of white former abolitionists who, while they were very much invested in ending slavery, were not convinced of black equality. Again, like most white Americans at the time. And so what you see is Lincoln fully clothed, standing over a crouching African American and sort of freeing him, right? Now, some of the commissioners were, good students of history. In fact, good students of the present that unfolded before their eyes. And they were like, look, because they chose a model of the statue that was already made by a sculptor named Thomas Ball, right? And so it was called Lincoln and a Crouching Slave. And they said, look, we love your statue, but we got to make a few adjustments here to make it more in sync with the actual history, right? So they said, look, a lot of these black folks ran away. A lot of these black folks served in the Union Army. Lincoln didn't just free them, right? And in fact, many of them freed themselves. And so they asked that this picture of the crouching slave actually be depicted with his hands sort of clenched, breaking his own chains. And so you end up getting this really contradictory figure, right? Here is a slave being freed by Lincoln who is freeing himself. Well, which one is it, right? They couldn't decide, so they split the difference, right? Now, these nuances aside, a group of protesters that was led by a Harvard University student by the name of Glenn Foster wanted the statue down, period. And Foster actually explained his group's reasoning to the city paper in June of 2020. He said, toppling the Pike statue really invigorated me to do it with the Emancipation Memorial in the same way. I just felt like we can actually create some change. We can actually get rid of these symbols of oppression and not wait for the government, because the power does rely on the people. And I should point out that Foster, to a certain degree, embodied a long, simmering hostility to this statue. And by the way, this is a picture of Glenn Foster in the red shirt that says staff on the back, speaking to some of the crowds that had gathered around the Emancipation Memorial in June. This is sort of late June. Soon after this, a fence would be erected around it, and so you couldn't quite gather around it this way, and I'll talk about that fence in a moment. But he's calling on people right then and there in that picture, like, tear this thing down. Let's go get some ropes. Let's go get a car. Let's get this thing off its pedestal, just like we did with Albert Pike. But there were dissenters. You have trouble seeing them here, but folks in that crowd weren't all saying, yeah. Many of them were, but many others were like, that's wrong. Most of these people were older African Americans who had been steeped in the history of this statue. They remembered that the Emancipation Parade, the largest celebration of emancipation to take place in the District of Columbia, from the end of slavery all the way through the end of the Civil War, in 1866, all the way through to 1901. One of the biggest parades in the city at the time, sometimes bigger than the inauguration, would loop around this statue. They remember that Frederick Douglass spoke at the dedication of this statue. They remembered that the National Council of Negro Women had actually remade this park and placed a statue of Mary McLeod Bethune, one of their most important leaders, right across from the Emancipation Memorial because they thought that this was an important statue. And then, of course, you had the head of the Association of African American Life and History, the founders of Black History Month, and their president issued a letter saying, please don't tear the statue down. It's terribly important to African Americans. And so some of those older African Americans who knew this history said, we do not want to tear this statue down, offensive though the imagery may be. Right? And so there was a debate going on at the foot of this statue. And Foster essentially pushes this aside. I actually reached out to him over Facebook because it's the only way I could find them, kids, right? And I said, you know, there are a lot of people that disagree with you. And he said the following. The people who came before us have left this world more exploited, racially tense, and inept than they are led to believe. That is why we don't highly regard what they have to say. Truly, the revolution we're going to embark upon answers to no one. That's why we are fighting to get this statue down regardless of older public opinion. And so sort of flush with the rashness of youth, he essentially says, I don't care what these older folks think. I don't really care about this history that you think is so important, Musgrove. We want to get this thing down because it's important to changing the world today. Now, in a bizarre twist to this whole story, I should point out, it's actually the Trump administration that saves the Emancipation Memorial. An administration that cares almost nothing about the actual facts of American history and is deeply hostile to any history that focuses on African Americans, and particularly slavery and emancipation. But as part of a broad push to save statues around the country, and really a propaganda push to try and divide the country along pro or con statues, period, as opposed to specific statues that honor the Confederacy and other statues that honor our national life. The Trump administration puts up a fence around it, dispatches National Park Police, and effectively says, you're not tearing this statue or any of the other statues that they're doing this with around town down. And very quickly after the fence go up and the police are dispatched, Foster and his group begins to fade away after they realize they're not going to get this thing down. This is not something that they can make happen. Now, if you look closely at this story, what you see are two different approaches to history that have become very popular with Americans today. One is roughly liberal, and the other is Trumpian, for lack of a better word. The historian Matthew Karp describes them in an article for Harper's Magazine, and I want to just lay out what Karp says here to give you specifics about how we're going to frame our discussion. Karp says this of the liberals. He says, current American inequalities, many liberals insist, must be addressed through encounters with the past. Programs of reform or redistribution, no matter how ambitious, can hope to succeed only after the country undergoes a profound reckoning. To use the key word of the day, with centuries of racial oppression. Meanwhile, and so he's essentially saying that, look, liberals believe that the path to change must go through and potentially even end with a reckoning with history. On the other side, he says this of the Trumpians. The right's most potent energy in the age of Trump has mobilized not around traditional peons to gods, generals, and founders, the sort of old school hagiographic history, but an erratic brand of troll humor. The goal here is not to develop an alternative right-wing version of U.S. history, but simply to mock the libs using their own language, right? And much of the coverage on Fox News and the press releases coming out of the Trump administration when this gates were going up were, we're going to try and protect the history of African Americans and of our great country from these crazy liberals and lefties who are out in the street just destroying everything for no reason. Okay, now I wanted to begin with these two sort of very popular approaches to American history that we see out there on the streets, and that really, came to embrace the feelings of probably a majority of Americans in the summer of 2020, because we want to argue to stay away from them. Right? But we want to be conscious of them so that we can stay away from them. Now that we're conscious of these approaches, we want to suggest an alternative. History, to our minds, to Chris's and mine, should be mined for two things: a complex understanding of the past, and two, for both understanding, inspiration, and warning as we prepare for action today. In other words, we want a history that doesn't flatter us completely and totally. We want a history that challenges us, where we actually seek a true understanding of the past, whether it bodes well for our current prejudices or not. Then once we've learned from that, we want to take inspiration from it. We want to take instruction from it. We want to make sure that we know the downsides of some of the political endeavors that people have engaged in the past, so that we can be ready to act in the here and now. And so, all of this being the case, we've organized our conversation around a couple of questions that we actually developed with Will Ed. So when we first sat down to do the Kirk Symposium, we said, well, what does the congregation want to know about? What is the congregation wrestling with? And he said the following, and so we've literally tried to organize the stories we're about to tell around this. First, how do you tell the story of Foundry and of the city honestly and with an eye toward justice and coalition building? And so we're going to lay out some stories that we think will help us to wrestle with that question. How do we address unequal growth and prosperity in a gentrifying city? And so we're going to address that one, goodness, head on. And then how do institutions that were created and separated by segregation heal the relationships between different groups? And again, we'll talk about the struggles that an organization that tried to do that had in mid-20th century DC. And so our plan is to present those three stories and then collectively step back as members of small groups, member of a larger group, and try to figure out what lessons we can draw from those stories to help us with our political projects today. And of course, for the fourth story, we'll get to freestyle and talk about whatever you guys want, and we have a great deal of ammunition here. And so with that, I will stop talking and turn things over to Chris for our first story.
Thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
Our good man, Frederick. So the first part that we're going to talk about today is about complicating history, and we brought up the whole issue of many states trying to step away from complicated history and trying to ban divisive concepts. We don't want our kids talking about race. We don't want to get our kids talking about these things that might make people feel uncomfortable and so forth. And Derek and I, obviously, and many of our colleagues in the history field are appalled by this, because that's what we do, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole idea, is that we want to complicate things. We want people to feel uncomfortable. If you read Chocolate City and you don't feel uncomfortable, you should read it again, right? Because you kind of missed the point. And so we're going to talk a little bit about complicating part of our history. And we're going to start with this man. I'm driving in from the airport late at night last night, and there he is. There it is under the lights. It's always so beautiful. Abraham Lincoln occupies a special place in the pantheon of American history. And I want to talk a bit about him and his role in D.C. in particular. What I'd like for you to do, though, is I'd like for all of us on Zoom and in person just to spend a couple minutes. If you have a pen and paper, you can jot some ideas down. If you don't, just kind of think, what do you think of Lincoln? Right? With all the monuments, all the textbooks, he's on Mount Rushmore, he's everywhere. There's 1,000 books that come out every decade about him. What do you think of him? So let's just take a couple minutes, 2 or 3 minutes on your own, sort of thinking through in your own mind what you make of this man, our 16th president. But actually, I want you to write first. I want everybody to have a chance to think about it first on their own, and then we're going to talk. So yeah, we're going to get to yours in just a minute. But I want everybody to have a chance to just quietly in your own mind think about what you think of him. Take another minute or so. Just think about him. I do this with my students in my class, and it's interesting because in our world, it's very rare for us to actually spend 3 or 4 minutes just thinking, not looking at our phones, not chatting with somebody, not checking our email, not whatever, but actually just thinking quietly. So I like to do that. What I'd like for you to do now is chat with your neighbor about it. We've got these tables set up with 3 or 4 people, 2 people. Chat with your neighbor about what you wrote or what you were thinking about this man, Abraham Lincoln, who occupies such an important place in our history and culture. And on Zoom, we're going to have Eric is going to set up groups of 4 or 5 people to do the same thing. All right, so talk amongst yourselves here. And share your ideas. Get to know your partners. try to cut off our conversations here, which I know are the fun thing I like about this is that each group takes the same question and goes in 5 different directions. And so the conversations just go very, very differently. And that's kind of what we want you all to do with this book. And some of you have been part of the reading groups and different focus group or discussion groups, which is fantastic because at the end of the day, this is your book, not ours. Right? This is your history, not ours. And you're going to make of it something different than we might have originally intended. Right? And so what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about Lincoln and his role here, particularly in D.C., and particularly with what was known as the Colonization Movement. If you've read Chocolate City, you know a little bit about this movement, which had its roots largely in D.C. When we think of abolitionism had its roots in Philadelphia, and the Revolution had its roots in Boston. But colonization was really rooted in D.C. and the elite white leadership of D.C. Men like Francis Scott Key, who believed that as members of the post-revolution generation, they had a particular duty to absolve America of its moral debt. And the debt was that they had enslaved Africans. And so these were people who believed that slavery was wrong for a variety of reasons, but they also did not believe in racial equality. And so they had this conundrum, right? Which many of us from the 21st century see right away, right? Oh, you say all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence, and yet you have slavery, you hypocrites, you. And we kind of leave it at that. And men like Francis Scott Key and Elias Caldwell and these elite leaders of white Washington, they said, yeah, this is a real problem. We are hypocrites. We got to do something about it. And what they said was, what we got to do is get rid of the black people, because we can't enslave them forever, because that's hypocritical, it's immoral, and it turns us into barbarians. And so if we really want to be a beacon of freedom, which we think the United States is, if we really want to be the land of the free, as Francis Scott Key, of course, penned in the national anthem, then we have to resolve this contradiction. And the way to resolve it is to free the slaves and send them back. Because we can't just free the slaves, because once they're free, they're going to expect to have all the rights of American citizens. And we can't have that. Right? Because their racial prejudice was such, they could not envision a future in which black people shared the same rights as white people did. Men, I should say. Black men shared the same rights as white men did. And so the solution was, we're going to take them, quote unquote, back where they came from, as the crowds these days say. Right? We're going to send them back where they came from. Of course, Africans came from 8,000-mile stretch of African coastline. It's not like they came from one place. It's not like Africa was one place. But they said, well, look, we're going to buy land, and Congress appropriated money to buy land, which is now Liberia, and thousands of former slaves were shipped back to Liberia. And in this way, white Americans felt like they were doing the humanitarian thing. Francis Scott Key certainly thought he was a humanitarian by doing so. Abraham Lincoln also thought he was a humanitarian by believing in colonization. Colonization was very important to Lincoln's philosophy as an early politician. As you may recall from Chocolate City, Abraham Lincoln wanted to end slavery and the slave trade in D.C. when he was a member of Congress, very short-term member of Congress, but he tried to end slavery, but he wanted to end slavery on white people's terms, right? He wanted to end slavery, but only if the white slave owners consented to do it, and only gradually. Of course, white slave owners did not consent to do it, certainly not in Washington. And so his original bill died very quickly in 1849. But as a political thinker, as a candidate for Senate, as a candidate for president, he continually believes that the long-term solution to what he thinks of as the problem of black people in America, the long-term solution is colonization. And he even writes this in, he even insists upon it in the Emancipation Bill, which we rightly celebrate in the city on April 16th, right? April 16th, 1862, more than 8 months before the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved people in this city are freed, gain their freedom through the Emancipation Act. Lincoln insists that emancipation is compensated and that colonization is encouraged. They set up money to encourage people to leave, once freed, that they would leave and go to Liberia. There was actually a big debate over an amendment about whether colonization would be voluntary or mandated. And in fact, it was tied. The vice president, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, steps in to break the tie and defeat that amendment. But otherwise, it would have been mandated that the 3,100 enslaved people who gained their freedom in D.C. would then be sent to Liberia. That's how popular colonization was. It had a powerful hold. And again, this was considered the racially egalitarian option for elite white leaders at the time, including President Lincoln. In fact, even after the Emancipation Bill in 1862, when a delegation of black Washingtonians goes to meet with him, he brings it up again. In the midst of the war, after Gettysburg and all the rest, after African-American soldiers have proved their mettle in battle, he's still talking about, well, maybe if you don't want to go to Liberia, how about Chiriquí in Panama? He's like, that's a little closer, we can get some land there. He's still talking about it. And so, this complicates, I know for many of my students, when we teach about colonization, this really complicates their understanding of Abraham Lincoln. They're like, oh my gosh, I thought he was the great emancipator, big abolitionist, like he believed in racial equality. We have a big temple for him on the National Mall, right? This is our man. And yet, as Frederick Douglass would say, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model, talking about the African-American community here. In his interests, his associations, his habits of thought, his prejudices, he was a white man. The white people of this country were his children, Douglass says. African Americans, at best, were the stepchildren. How does that history of colonization shape our sense of who Lincoln was? Or, does it? I know for many of my students, of course, they're 18, 19 years old. They've got the kind of the storybook history, and maybe not the more complicated history, but for them it's really shocking to hear this about a man many of them consider a very heroic figure. How does that shape your understanding of this man? Any volunteers or thoughts about Lincoln in general? Yes, ma'am. Let me get you just so the people on Zoom can hear you.
What I'd said in our small group was that Lincoln didn't demean the humanity of blacks, unlike Thomas Jefferson and some others who, new literature that's come out that talked about how he didn't think they were really smart enough to be citizens or whatever. And I had believed that Lincoln really treated people as people. This sort of upends that. In the reality, they still should be deported. So that's shocking.
A bit shocking to your conception of him as being at least fundamentally more humanitarian. Certainly, he didn't own slaves, as Jefferson and 11 other of our first presidents did. Yes?
I think maybe some of these kind of, jolting realities change the power balance a bit. So we can, I like how you called it a temple to Lincoln. I mean, if you take a step back and look at all these statues, it kind of reduces at least my feelings of democracy. And so when you see that these people are real, as am I, then we don't look upon them as gods, and that it perhaps on some level, a couple steps removed, it is empowering in some way.
Oh, that it's empowering. That yes, this is a shocking truth, but in some ways that helps us see them as full people, not immortals on the pedestal, right? As we frame him, and we really did put him up on that throne downtown. but that's actually kind of exciting because, yeah, he's more complicated than we thought. Okay, interesting. Yes.
If you go out to Lincoln's home, which is out northeast, where he went with his wife after his son died, they reestablished a place to live. If you go through that home, that's where I really learned what you just talked about. Because they say there, Lincoln dealt with it in the Emancipation Proclamation with a real problem because he realized how important black people were, and he would talk about it, but he couldn't quite get to the point where he could say, but they don't have to leave. But at least showed that he was aware of this, at least. I mean, I want us to know the fact that he didn't act on it, but he did know some of it. And there are a couple of incidents of people visiting him in which they challenge him about that, and the conversations reported out. So at least we've got some place that's publicly talking about this.
Sure, yeah, that is a wonderful spot to go to, the over by the old soldiers' home. It's kind of hidden, his little cottage out there. That was rural in his day. That was getting out to the country when he would go there for a little respite from being in downtown, all the squabbles going on, and that was his getaway. So he's thinking about it. Like he's wrestling with some of his own contradictions, and maybe that makes him seem more human and more like us, where we struggle to figure out what is it that we do? How do we make this a just city? What is my own role in this, right? And so maybe it does help us see him as even more of a model, because it's not like he knows what to do and just does it the right way, perfectly. Right? He's struggling with it. Yes.
This is really more a question. Do you have a sense that Lincoln's attitudes evolved, and that just before he was assassinated, he was thinking somewhat differently than when he ran for Congress in Illinois?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes Lincoln special in some ways, and he does evolve. I mean, his ideas evolve. They evolve in these conversations where he's challenged on it. His famous relationship with Frederick Douglass has a large impact on his thinking. He changed. He's evolving both in his own mind and also politically, as he's trying to figure out politically how to get done what he wants to get done without destroying everything else in the process. And I think you can make a case that his mindset is changing. He's seeing things. The presence and the record of black troops in the Union Army certainly has an effect on his thinking and on the thinking of many others, to say, wow, they have proved themselves in battle, but not only that, they are the margin of victory. Right? Before black troops enter the equation, I mean, we're basically in a stalemate, right? Both sides thought it was going to be a quick war, and neither side was right. I mean, before 1863, there's just a lot of bloodshed and not a whole lot of movement either way. But the presence of black soldiers is a decisive turning point, and turns the war in the Union's favor. And so, yes, he's evolving, probably not as quickly, perhaps, as we might want. What do you make of this comment from Frederick Douglass, now a decade on beyond his assassination, that he's a white man's president? He's not our man or our model. And I saw this quote on my Facebook feed. I can't tell you how many times people would be like, they'd throw it out there and leave it up there without context. Yes. Oh, sorry. Keep forgetting about that.
He can't be other than a white man's president.
Mm-hmm.
He's a white man, and black people don't participate in the politics. What I find interesting is how we develop these ideas about who people are, because I think Foundry has its own thing about President Lincoln, who came to the church about once or twice. But another president, President Rutherford B. Hayes, who spent lots of time here and was in fact a member, is not mentioned, hardly mentioned in our history. And in one case, we identify with the great emancipator, but Hayes, who ended Reconstruction, we don't even want to talk about him as a member of our church. And so we create these ideas and images. And I think that there really wasn't much difference between Rutherford B. Hayes and Abraham Lincoln. They were both politicians dealing with the politics of their time. And so I can go with Frederick Douglass.
Thank you, sir. Yes.
One of the things I took away from my time here at Foundry a long time ago was every Lincoln's birthday, we would get a sermon from Ed Bauman about Lincoln. And one of the things I took away was he was a master tactician. He quite, in other words, he was quite the political animal. And I didn't quite understand that, but as I look at what we're now living through ourselves today, which might not be all that different because we never dealt with the problems. The human tendency is just to cover things up until we make it so bad, we'll be extinct. But that so to take on a position of leadership, there are no easy answers, and yeah, it's difficult, and race does matter in terms of the unfortunately it does matter in terms of who the leader is. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a real good point. Maybe one more comment, and then we'll wrap this up a bit.
Yeah, I've wondered if America felt it needed Lincoln to the sort of myth of Lincoln as a receptacle and a mechanism for closing out that time period, in that sense, to sort of make Americans feel better about the fact that we had ended slavery, and somehow that was the end of the whole problem of race. And, I don't know what would have happened had Lincoln not been assassinated and been martyred and become, so much easier to mythologize because of the way he died. But as a white president in that time, there was simply no way, I think, we would have found a black man or woman to be our image of having solved our problem and put it away. And there's so many points in our history where we want to just close out the conversation and decide, declare victory and move on and around race. And it seems as though those years just after the assassination and the sort of all of the era of Reconstruction that led into Jim Crow is sort of a point at which Lincoln became a convenient and maybe necessary embodiment of this idea that, okay, America's fine again now. Let's just,
Right. Get a nice mission accomplished banner.
The Union was preserved. And as a Southerner, Southerners became kind of all in on the notion of the United States after the war. That's a whole topic in and of itself. But, the Union was preserved, but it's a white Union.
Right. Especially by the turn of the 19th century. I love this conversation, like thinking about, you all think about it in very different ways than, say, my students do, who are 20 years old, more nuanced way. But what I want to do is I want to give Frederick Douglass the last word, in a sense, because I want to continue from that same speech where he says this, because again, over the last couple years in particular, I've seen people put this up on their Facebook and just leave it at that. Say, this is the final word. But he goes on, and he says many things. It's a wonderful speech. This is from the speech where he dedicates the statue that Derek's talking about in 1876. He is a D.C. resident at this point. He says, despite the mist and haze that surrounded him, despite the tumult, the hurry and confusion of the hour, we, African Americans, he's talking about here, we were able to take a comprehensive view of Abraham Lincoln and to make reasonable allowance for the circumstances of his position. We saw him, measured him, estimated him, not by stray utterances to injudicious and tedious delegations who often tried his patience, not by isolated facts torn from their connection. That's what we do all the time in our age. Not by any partial and imperfect glimpses caught at inopportune moments, but by a broad survey in the light of the stern logic of great events and in view of that divinity which shapes our ends. Rough hew them how we will. We came to the conclusion that the hour and the man of our redemption had somehow met in the person of Abraham Lincoln. It mattered little to us what language he might employ on special occasions. It mattered little to us when we fully knew him, whether he was swift or slow in his movements. It was enough for us that Abraham Lincoln was at the head of a great movement and was in living and earnest sympathy with that movement, which, in the nature of things, must go on until slavery shall be utterly and forever abolished in the United States. And I add that in because I think we sometimes stop at the soundbite, something that's easy to post on Facebook, and we all do it, right? It's kind of the plague of our age, right? We just look at the headline. We don't even read the article. We make snap judgments about people, or we read one thing about something somebody said 30 years ago and be like, aha, I know that person, right? That's a bad, they're on the bad side. They're on the wrong side. And Douglass is saying, look, you have to take a broad survey. Not just of Lincoln, but of all of it, right? Take a broad survey. Don't just rip the fact out of its context. Don't just cherry pick your evidence. But look at the broad. Douglass had lots of problems with Lincoln, right? And he told Lincoln to his face about his problem, right? He was the one who badgered Lincoln into letting black soldiers serve in the Union Army. He knew that Lincoln, he was not hesitant to make his objections known. He knew Lincoln's shortcomings. He understood all about colonization. And yet, in the broad survey of the man, he's going to have a different view. Right? And that's why he was there on that day in 1876 to dedicate this statue and argue for why it was necessary and why it was so important that this was done by the black community themselves. That's part of why so many people came out to say no. Don't tear this down, right? Yes, we would not make a statue like this today, but that's not the point. right? History's complicated. People are complicated. We need to understand things in a fuller context before we rush to judgment. So with that, we're gonna stop here and take a little break. We've been sitting for a long time. So let's take a 5-minute break, 5-minute break on Zoom, and we'll come back together and do a second little vignette about DC.
How many people are watching on Zoom?
I think 30 or 35, something like that.
Right.
All right, so 5 minutes, 5 minutes. Get some orange juice, get a bite to eat, go to the bathroom. That he could win. Yeah.
You and Okay, if everybody could make their way back to their seats. So the first question we addressed was sort of telling the history of the city and in your own cases of the church, honestly, and sort of trying to figure out how to deal with all of its complexity. What we want to do now is address this second question that Will Ed gave us, which is how do we address how do institutions that were created and separated by segregation heal the relationships between different groups? And to do that, Chris is going to talk about Neighbors, Inc., which I'm sure many of you know is a very prominent organization in my neighborhood, Shepherd Park, but also in Tacoma, Manor Park, and several other northeast and northwest neighborhoods. And so, Chris, take it away.
Sure, we're going to kind of follow the same pattern that we just did, which is I'm going to ask a question, have you think about and talk about with your neighbors first, and then we're going to launch into a discussion of the history of Neighbors, Inc. in particular, and the issues that it raises. So the question I want to open with is, I'd love for you to just think about or describe your ideal neighborhood. Okay, so just take 2 or 3 minutes. You can jot some ideas down or think about them in your head. What would your ideal neighborhood look like here in this city? What would you want to see there? What would be part of this neighborhood? What values would you want it to encompass? So take 2 or 3 minutes and just write these down. Write down your thoughts. Ideas with your neighbors, with your friends at the table, or in a breakout group on Zoom. We'll break you up into breakout rooms. Spend about 3 or 4 minutes sharing your vision of an ideal neighborhood, what you want to see in your neighborhoods in the city. So talk amongst yourselves. back together as a full group so we can chat about these ideas. I'd love to hear some of your ideas about what things that you would see or that you would want to see in your ideal neighborhood. So what are some thoughts that you all came up with in your groups? Oh.
Hi. Jerry and I pretty much agreed on the first four things. The ideal neighborhood would be racially integrated, but also age integrated. So there'd be little kids and old folks, and in between. There'd be green space, parks, recreation, small commercial, and yeah, I think that's where we were. And then, I threw in a strong citizens association.
Of course.
Very DC, right? You
There you
have
go.
your neighbor,
Thank you.
ANC.
Oh, you can add.
Just one addition. I've done a lot of campaigning since 16 in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is so much more integrated than DC. You have a strip of 2 or 3 or 4 blocks. You'll knock on the door, you'll get an African American. You'll knock on doors, you'll get white folks. You knock on doors, you'll get somebody from the Middle East or Asia. That, in my experience, doesn't happen here in DC.
Interesting.
There you go.
So we have racially integrated, age integrated, green space, good citizens movement, other things that you don't want to see in what you would consider a great neighborhood, something that you want to live in.
For me, it has to include economic equity. I mean, you can't have people living in $1 million homes and in tents.
Okay, so economic equity, right? And would you say economic diversity? Like to have some middle class people, lower income housing, like all together, that not have these areas where it's just one giant $1 million home after another, boom, 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 boom. Okay. Yeah, from the Zoom.
Accessible, clean, safe, reflects the full demographic range.
Accessible, right? And thinking about access probably in lots of different ways. Clean, safe, right? Reflecting the full demography of our city. These are lots of really important values that I think many folks here at Foundry would share. What I want to talk about now is a short history we talk about in Chocolate City about people who have organized to try to either create or protect what they would consider their ideal neighborhoods. And so we're going to talk a little bit about restrictive covenants, because in a lot of ways, restrictive covenants were used to protect what people considered their ideal neighborhood. Right, so if we were talking 100 years ago, and as was mentioned, at that time Foundry was all white, and if we asked about that, what would be your ideal neighborhood? People would say, well, it has to be all white, right? The white community in this town wanted to protect and preserve what they considered an ideal neighborhood. And number one on that list was not racial integration, it was racial segregation. And how to protect that. And how to protect that was by putting restrictive covenants into the deeds themselves. Right? And we see here, so nothing is going to be sold to or occupied or acquired by any person of Negro blood or any person of the Semitic race, blood, or origin, which racial description shall be deemed to include Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, or Syrians. Right? They had to make sure they got everybody here. And these were written into deeds all around this area, all around the city. This is a map. It's a little hard to see, but it's this fantastic website called Mapping Segregation in DC. And what Sarah Schoenfeld, a friend of ours, and her team have just produced these incredible maps showing where these restricted covenants were. And they blanketed the city. Basically, wherever white homeowners felt that they had something to protect, where they were worried that there would be black encroachment somewhere close by. If there was a black neighborhood nearby and they were worried that some black home buyers would come into their neighborhood, they would try to protect their investment, their neighborhoods, the things that they valued. When somebody mentioned safe, right? What does it mean to be safe? Well, in the context of early 20th century DC, for white Washingtonians, that meant white, right? If you had a black person, black family living in the neighborhood, ipso facto, it was unsafe, right? And so they're protecting their ideal neighborhood through these covenants. These covenants were protected by the Supreme Court. 1926, Buchanan v. the Corrigan v. Buckley decision. The Supreme Court basically says, well, nothing we can do about it. Those are, those are private contracts. You sign them, there's nothing the courts can do. The court reverses itself 2 decades later in Heard v. Hodge in D.C. It's Shelley v. Kramer everywhere else, because, of course, D.C. has its own legal standing. And so the Supreme Court says, no, actually, those are not contracts that are legally enforceable. You can put them in, but there's no court that's going to be allowed to protect them. And so in the years after Heard v. Hodge, slowly, many of these white neighborhoods become more and more integrated. Black home buyers come, because there's a huge, you can imagine the black population is growing tremendously in the 1950s because there's a huge migration into this area, and almost all the white migrants go to the suburbs because there's easy financing out in the suburbs. The suburbs are still segregated. So all the black migrants go into the city. And so you have this racial basically separation that happens. And D.C. goes from being 2/3 white to being majority black from 1950 to 1960. As that's happening, white homeowners now don't have that protection from the Supreme Court, and they are selling rapidly. You have real estate agents who are knocking on doors saying, did you see a black family just bought a house down the block? Your neighborhood is going fast. You need to sell. Right? They called this block busting. If you could get one black homeowner to buy a house on a block, you could bust that block up and get the whites to sell. They called it panic selling, sell for whatever they could get and leave the city. And then the agent would come in, raise the price, sell it to a black family, boom, nice little profit. Right? So neighborhood after neighborhood, block after block would go through this racial transition. In the midst of this white flight, this group, Neighbors Incorporated, joined together in the areas that Derek mentioned, up in Shepherd Park, Manor Park, Tacoma. This little section, they said, look what's happening around the city. White people are fleeing. Neighborhoods have gone from all white to all black in the matter of 5 years. Like, we don't want that. We have a good neighborhood here. We love it here. We don't want to leave. And if they were talking about their ideal neighborhood, they actually would use the words that many of us said, right? Safe, reflective of the democracy, racially integrated, age integrated, great schools, lots of playgrounds and recreation space. They said many of the same things, and they believed in racial integration. They said, look, we think it's good. We don't want to move to what they called the sterile suburbs. We like living in town. We like having a racially diverse community. We want to protect that. They may not have addressed the economic equity questions that you brought. These were very middle and upper middle class areas, and still is up there. But they wanted to have a racially integrated, even if it was an economically stratified community. But with all these things that they considered valuable. Well, how do you protect that in an environment where there's panic selling, where real estate agents are targeting neighborhoods, where public policy is encouraging white homeowners to go to the suburbs? And and newspapers are still classifying things by race. This is a white neighborhood, this is a black neighborhood, house for sale, and so forth. What do? So Neighbors Incorporated was an effort, a grassroots, a neighborhood effort to deliberately try to protect a racially integrated community. And so this is the Board of Neighbors Incorporated, 1959, 1960, and I have a laser. Oh, there it is. There's Marvin Kaplan, whose idea it was. And many of the white people who were involved were, like Marvin Kaplan, were Jewish. They were connected to the synagogue there that was also committed to staying in the city, staying in a racially diverse community, and said, look, let's recruit a range of African American and white American people to serve together and jointly protect this neighborhood. And they did, and for several years, they had a house. They posted signs and they said, "Look, we have the perfect neighborhood, right? We have a racially integrated neighborhood with great schools and parks and recreation, all these wonderful amenities in the city. You can come and live here as well." And so they were very deliberate, very active in trying to recruit people to come and stay in there, and encourage white families in particular to stay. Like, don't listen to all that panic stuff about the city going down the tubes or whatever. No, this is our city, and it's going to be a better city by being racially integrated. They did all these events. They had art and book festival every year. They brought people together, and it was very consciously integrated, trying at every step to keep things integrated. And yet they couldn't, in the end, maintain that a racial balance that was enough to make white families comfortable in staying. And over time, basically only Shepherd Park stayed relatively integrated, well integrated racially by the late 1960s. And a lot of it came down to the schools. White parents were ultimately very uncomfortable sending their kids to schools where their children would not be in the majority. And there were all these articles about what they called the tipping point. And then later in the 70s and 80s, a lot of academic research about where that tipping point was. Was it one African American in school that led white people to leave? In some places maybe, but not in DC. Was it 20%? 50%? 75%? At what point do white families no longer feel like it's their school, or that their school is safe, quote unquote, for their own child? And Marvin Kaplan, the founder of Neighbors Inc., he sent his kids to the local schools, and he watched as more and more of the white families either left the Neighbors Inc. neighborhoods or just sent their kids somewhere else, sent them to the private schools that were burgeoning at the time. He kept his kids in, but his daughter, his eldest daughter, who graduated, she was basically one of the handful of students at Coolidge High School by the late 1960s, and she graduates and she tells her parents, she says, "Don't do that to my siblings. Don't make them go through what I had to go through. It's not fair to them." And Kaplan decides, ultimately, okay, we won't do that. And they don't leave the neighborhood, but they petition and they get accepted. They petition to send their children to Alice Deal and Wilson High School on the other side of the park, which are majority white. And so, ultimately, you can look at Neighbors from the late 1950s to the late 1960s, early 1970s. It stayed active, but ultimately, Neighbors was not able to create or protect what they considered their ideal neighborhood, a racially integrated a racially integrated neighborhood with great schools and safe places for kids to play and so forth. They weren't able to do that. So I want you to kind of think first on your own, and then we'll talk about it. I want you to think about whether or not the fact does the fact that neighbors failed to stop white flight from the schools and from the city make the organization itself a failure? And do you think the Kaplans were right to send their kids to these schools that were increasingly, where their children were an increasingly smaller minority? When they first started going in elementary school, whites were in the majority. By middle school, they're in the minority. By high school, their daughter's just about the last white kid in her class. Did they do the right thing by sending their kids to that school? And that leads to a last question, which is, to what extent should people with privilege and power, someone like the Kaplans, they could have moved out of the city and bought a house in the suburbs. They didn't. They could have sent their kids to private schools. They didn't. They could have gotten an exemption and sent their kids to the majority white schools west of the park, which they ended up doing. To what extent should people with power sacrifice, quote unquote, for their principles? So I want you to mull those over in your head for a little bit.
It's all good. All good. Turn off your mic. I don't know if you want to add about
this. First. Yep. Okay, well, so now just think about those questions. Chat it over with your partners. These questions about, was Neighbors a failure because it failed to achieve its goal? Were the Kaplans right in how they responded, particularly about the schools? And to what extent should people with power and privilege sacrifice that power and privilege in order to advance some different principle that they believe in? All right? So we can break them. running rapidly. Excellent. Do you want to bring that point now? Yeah, we should. Okay, so we're going to come back together as a group and talk about some of these questions about power and about quote unquote sacrifice, and what people do when they want to protect their neighborhoods, right? And different ways that they use their power to do so. So I'd love to just hear some of your thoughts about from the conversations that have emerged from your various tables.
And Willette, if you have any online, please go ahead and throw them in as well.
There we go.
Thanks. It seemed to me that when it comes to protecting your kids, parents will do a lot of different things. And the one thing that neighbors might have been able to do, depending on the timing, was stay and try to make the schools that their kids were going to go to better. And so, don't have to pull your kids out and send them to a different school.
All right. Is that your hand up?
Trying to get my thoughts together because Derek and I both live very close to Marvin Kaplan Park, which is right there on Alaska Avenue.
Yeah.
And we live in Shepherd Park, which is a very diverse neighborhood. And Neighbors Inc. was perhaps most successful, as you said, in Shepherd Park. So in the long view, and Neighbors Inc. still exists, just some fraction of it, I think. But it's a long-term view, and the sacrifices that Black people made to get equal education were equally charged with mental and spiritual and aspirational impact on our children as it was on white children who didn't have prom dates and all the wonderful things that they thought they needed to have by having white quarters and white teachers. So this is fraught with real problems for me because it's not a win-win for anybody. But in living in Shepherd Park, and Derek has younger children, one of the things when I moved into that neighborhood in the 90s, I was standing watching the children walk into school on the first day of school. And you had these Black parents in suits and dads holding little girls' hands and kissing their little girls goodbye and their little sons, It was like a loving neighborhood. So if you ever get to a sense to pause and see how real commitment to education and love of children works, then the color thing disappears. And Shepherd Park has always kind of maintained a reputation for being a very reputable educational institution. So, it's difficult, but in the end, it is the best toward moving us forward as a society. And I think Shepherd Park is a beacon for that. And Derek, you can certainly speak to it because you're an active parent. I just observe the neighborhood. But what Neighbors Inc. stood for is a beacon for a lot of neighborhoods to say, this can really work.
Yeah. So what we love about the Neighbors Inc. story is that it is this really sincere effort to create the beloved community, right? And it's focused on the individual choices of its members, Black and white, right? Who are heroically trying to clean up, quite literally, a century of segregation that had been built up by public institutions, by sort of large and aggressive private institutions like the real estate industry over time, which means that their individual choices are sort of going to be spitting into the wind against these major institutions and what they've done. And we are very conscious in telling this story that it's a story of these people losing, and losing quite badly, right? If you look at the larger context in which Neighbors Inc. is operating, it's founded in 1957. It operates in a really robust fashion through the late 1960s. So in that roughly decade and a half period, let's start with 1950 and go to 1970, more than half of the white population leaves Washington, D.C. More than half. 300,000 people plus, right? At the same time, the black population more than doubles, right? Well over 200,000 people move into the city. The reason for that is that the suburbs are growing at breakneck speed, and they are open exclusively to white DC residents who move into them because they've got nice little cheap houses, which are backed by FHA loans. They have good schools. They're brand spanking new. And of course, they don't have integration, right? At the same time, they're closed to African Americans who are moving to the city in droves, and so African Americans have no other option but to move into the center city, right? Now, then we have to add the class dimension, and this is terribly important here because Shepherd Park, Manor Park, Tacoma are not ghettos, right? They are middle-class neighborhoods. And DC has a very large black middle class. And there is tremendous, tremendous demand for good middle-class housing in the African-American community. We'll talk about it in just a second, but much of the center city downtown, which is the old black community, the old black belt, sort of stretching from Foggy Bottom up through Shaw around to Southwest, right? That is falling apart because of systematic neglect on the part of the city, systematic discrimination on the part of real estate investors. And so middle-class African Americans are desperately trying to get out. And those that are in Neighbors, Inc. have a problem, right? And so it's not just the Kaplans that are posed with a problem, right? Which is, are we comfortable being a minority? It's also the black members of Neighbors, Inc. who have a problem, which is this organization has decided to make this neighborhood integrated. And in a moment of white flight, what that means is recruiting more white people to stay in the neighborhood or to move into the neighborhood. Like that's Neighbors Inc.'s basic idea when it comes to real estate. You see a for sale sign go up, find a white family to buy that house. Because if we don't get them to buy that house, the neighborhood will tip, right? I mean, they're fighting a very specific thing that exists in the 1950s and 1960s, which is massive white flight. Blocks are literally turning over within a year, right? From all white to all black. So they're trying to fight that to keep the neighborhoods integrated. Well, what does that mean for the black members? They have to suppress their and their class group's need for housing in order to serve the larger goal of integration, right? And by the way, they have no problem living around other black people, right? The problem that they see living around other black people is that then the services will decline. Then the real estate agents will make it so that their houses are worth less on paper, right? Because remember, we still don't have a city government at this point, right? It's still Southern segregationists in Congress who are essentially overseeing the city. And so they see all the downsides of a black neighborhood, right? I mean, they're trying to move out of those types of neighborhoods to get those services. And so it's not just that these folks are trying to figure out how to get along, as this picture suggests, right? Like, we don't need to see race, we just color and have fun. It's really that there's a larger edifice that they are fighting. And that edifice is the entire real estate industry, the way the city government apportions services, how Congress apportions money and tells the city government how to operate. And they just can't beat it back, except in this one little sliver called Shepherd Park, right? Because major congregations like Tifereth Israel just say, right? And there's this wonderful quote that Kaplan puts in his book. He just says, you don't have to tell Jews that a ghetto is a bad thing, right? And so they decide to stay. They just refuse to leave, right? And they're able to find black neighbors who are willing to work with them to create that integrated community. But everyone has to sort of push back some of their private concerns for that greater good. They're only able to do it in a very small sliver of the city. The rest of the city basically flips. First the schools, then the neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, Chris, I took way too long.
And what he's talking about, part of why we want to talk about that, when you talk about fighting the entire edifice, right, of policy and economic forces and so forth, they're not so different from where we are now.
Yeah.
Right? when we're talking about gentrification and some of the changes that we're facing. Although the political context is different, right? We have home rule now, even if we don't have statehood, but the political structure is a bit different, and yet we're still in a similar kind of moment where there is rapid change, and it's happening on a macro level, not just in DC, but in many other places as well, that seems impossible to stop. And how can you protect what you think is important? So we're going to get to gentrification, but I think we want to take another little stretch break here. So just a couple minutes, and then we're going to go move a little bit forward in time into the 1970s and talk about a wave of gentrification in the 1970s. So let's just take a couple minutes, stretch yourselves out if you need more coffee or a restroom break. This is a good time to do it.
And we'll reconvene at 11:40.
11:40.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Didn't have the time. Is that 3
minutes? That's we gotta keep this train on the tracks. overtime and to still have time for the freestyle section. I'll take that as as an endorsement. So what I'm going to do for the next roughly 30 minutes is talk about this last issue that Will Ed brought up, which is the issue of unequal growth and prosperity in a gentrifying city. And I know that this is an issue of particular concern to the folks over at John Wesley, for instance, who are quite literally in the center of one of the neighborhoods that has gone through the highest level of gentrification in the entire city. And so if you look sort of at that strip of 14th Street where John Wesley is, you'll see that the population around it has essentially gone from 70% black to 70% white, roughly in the last 30 years, right? So a pretty remarkable transformation, and one that explains the difficulty of sort of finding a local congregation for that wonderful institution. But we're going to get into that conversation by moving over here to Seton Street. Now, for those of you who know the street, and you may even recognize it from this picture, which is from, I believe, 1977, it is this little wonderful one-block street, approximately a block south of the Marie Reed Community Center in Adams Morgan, sandwiched between the MPD district station there, Marie Reed, Florida Avenue, and U Street, right? For those of you who like coffee shops, Pleasant Pops is dead at the end of the street. Sort of you can look right out the window and look down the street. Used to be one of the places where I like to write. And I want to talk about this street because in April of 1976, a couple of individuals who live here, one of them, Joseph Lewis Jr., who we talk about in the book, 26 people in all, received notices from the new owners of their homes. Now, I should point out that everyone on this street was a renter in 1976. Everyone on this street was African American. And those 26 people had had their homes purchased by Center Properties, which was based in Bethesda. And the notices that they got were a 30-day notice of eviction. Center Properties had purchased these properties for about $11,000 each for each house. And they had a vision for what they were going to do with these properties. They were going to kick the renters out. They were going to essentially gut them because they were quite old. You can actually see in this picture that they had already been working with the city to tear up the sidewalks to put in higher levels, higher electricity transmission lines and better sewer lines because the street itself was quite old. And then they were going to make them into condos and townhouses for what we at the time called yuppies, right? And they were going to sell them for somewhere in the area of $50,000 to $75,000 each. And so they were going to realize a pretty handsome profit, right? You know, if you just base it on the purchase price, they could come up off of $60,000 per house, right? Of course, there's construction costs along the way. And the folks on Seton Street who got these notices, they were 26 people packed into 9 houses. By the way, there were other companies that were purchasing some of the other houses at the same time, and so they also received some of these same notices. Said, no. This is happening everywhere. This is happening in Columbia Heights. This is happening in Adams Morgan. This is happening in Logan Circle. This is happening in Capitol Hill. No, we don't want it to happen to us. And so they worked with a local organization called an Adams Morgan organization, hired a lawyer, young guy, fresh out of law school, named Johnny Barnes, who many of you would come to know as a big-time statehood advocate and as a chief of staff for Walter Fauntroy for years. And they decided to fight center and to try and stay in their homes. And we'll talk about what happened to them in a second, but what I want to talk about really quickly is why they came to this specific response to these notices. What is it that was happening around the city that informed what they were doing? A couple things that we have to do to get there. First is, I want you all to check out the article that I gave you. I'm sure many of you read it last night or this morning. That is part of a wonderful 4-part series in the Evening Star on what people called at the time private restoration. Americans did not use the term gentrification until the 1970s. It's actually an import from the UK. And so we call this process that we now know as gentrification, private restoration. And this was this sort of wonderful profile that the Evening Star was doing on private restoration in Washington, D.C. And they saw Washington, D.C. as a national leader in the process of private restoration. And so what I want us to do first and foremost, before we even get to the Seton Street folks, is get a working definition of private restoration / gentrification. What is it? Take just a minute, talk to the folks at your table, and based on what you've read or what you already know, come up with a working definition that doesn't exceed 2 sentences, right? Those folks who are online, go ahead and type it into the chat if you need to, but we're going to come up with a working definition, then we're going to talk about what these folks, how the folks on Seton Street regarded this thing that we call private restoration or gentrification. So 2 minutes. But, you know, we're short on time. So if folks could slowly bring it back next 10 seconds or so. Okay. Would one of the tables or would one of the folks online like to give us their working definition of gentrification / private restoration? So Will Ed's going to start us off.
This is from Ken. Using corporate funds to redevelop a neighborhood with or without the consent of current owners.
Nice, nice. Anyone else?
Removal of poor black residents and replacement with better off white residents.
I'll take that. Anyone else?
We had almost like that.
Okay, one more.
Maybe pricing people out of where they live in a way that disproportionately affects a certain demographic. And we were trying to decide whether it needs to be deliberate or not.
Nice. Excellent. So I am going to go, if you all don't mind, with door number 3, right? I want to be clear that your definition, which foregrounds race, right, is perfectly legitimate for Washington, D.C., because it's a description of gentrification roughly for the last 70 years or so, right? There aren't large poor white populations in the city after the 1960s. There are poor white people in the city, but they're not large poor white populations. We're not Philadelphia, we're D.C., right? And so you see this racial component, but gentrification as a generic definition, right, is really perfectly put forward by, please tell me your name again. Liz. Liz's definition, Liz's table's definition, is absolutely wonderful, right? It is the movement of the gentry, upper class people, into an area where poor people live in the subsequent displacement of those poor people. Doesn't necessarily have to be intentional. It often is abetted by corporate money through large real estate concerns, but it doesn't have to. And in fact, you see the different waves of gentrification that wash over the city. Some have a lot of corporate money in them. Others are really driven by the grassroots. But the key element, the thing that makes it gentrification or private revitalization, is the movement of the rich into a poor neighborhood and the subsequent displacement of the poor, whatever color they may be, right? And in DC, typically it's when you're talking about rich people, you're talking about white people generally. And when you're talking about poor people, you're talking about black people generally, right? Now, I want to just get into the article really quickly so that we can get into the minds of the Seton Street renters. The article is written from a specific perspective, and it talks about the people that are part of the story in a specific way. So here are my two questions for you all, and then I'll give you guys about 2 minutes again to break and talk about them. How does the reporter talk about the residents of Foggy Bottom in this story? What role do the residents of Foggy Bottom play in this story, number one? And then number two, how does a reporter, and by extension, I think you can argue city leaders and real estate interests, how do they feel about private restoration? i.e., is it a good thing, is it a bad thing? And so grab those questions really quickly, and then we'll come back in 2 minutes.
Moving along. We got good time. You should take as much time as you need.
On the first person to see if there's anything in the chat, and so I know you guys really want to keep talking about this, but I'm just worried that we won't have any freestyle time after this if we don't reconvene. So here are the two questions again. Where are the residents of Foggy Bottom in this story? How are they regarded by the reporter? And then the second question is, how do city leaders and the reporter feel about private restoration? And so who would like it? I'm not going to go ahead and let you all jump in wherever you want. Please, oh, yes.
Oh,
yeah, that's my job. Sorry.
So those two questions were really exactly what I was thinking as I was reading this. I started out thinking, who was living there? Where are they mentioned? And at the end of the first paragraph, they they do reference the miserable slums amongst almost wholly occupied by poverty-ridden Negro families. So at the end of the first paragraph, they have this very laden phrasing for who's living there. The whole rest of the story, they're not talking about who's there, what's going to happen. It made me think about in the book what happened to the people living in Southwest DC who were pushed out when that development happened. And so I kept thinking, hello, what are you thinking? And I got to the last paragraph and I thought, yes, this is exactly what's happening with the writers of this and their perspective, where it says that they are optimists with an inner vision that made them absolutely blind to what was around them, right? Which saw only the image of what Foggy Bottom could become.
Yeah.
So that right there, to me, summed up their perspective of what they were seeing, which was not reality and only going with what they wanted.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that we know for sure is that the population of Foggy Bottom, when this article, in the years before this article is written, because we should be clear that at this moment, Foggy Bottom is quite integrated, although by mistake, right? But it's principally a lower class black neighborhood. And for those of you who love DC comedy, you know that Petey Greene was a resident grew up in Foggy Bottom, right? Poor African American. But the neighborhood was changing rapidly as large numbers of well-to-do white residents were going in and flipping houses and selling them, oftentimes to what they would call about 10 years after this article is written, yuppies, right? Young white professionals. What does the author of the article think about this process? Is restoration a good thing as far as they are concerned? Sorry.
Definitely yes. And in part, there's this overlay of the Star identifying these gentrifiers as pushing back against sort of a bigger government plan to rip up the whole neighborhood and build a highway through it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sort of dismissal of the displacement of the black community, but an acknowledgement of sort of heroism that these other white folks have stymied the plans of the even bigger, more destructive plan of the urban renewal highway system, which was a fascinating part of your book.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you. And we'll get one more. And are there any online? Okay, that's all right. Online folks, we still love you. Not a problem.
I just have a question. Where was GW University at that point? Because those are all, I perceive them as relatively new buildings.
So
as I walk through that area.
So the GW's older center is further towards the White House. And so it was, on the edge of this neighborhood. But, the neighborhood that we think of as the neighborhood that's described here is really the one that's clustered around the edges of those huge gas storage tanks. And so I'll give you a picture in just a moment, right? Because it helps to see it. It looks nothing like it used to. I just want to return to your point really quickly before I give you some great pictures here. And that is that in this moment, in 1960, the folks who are running the city, and by the way, specifically the folks at the Evening Star are not just favorably inclined towards private restoration, they're actively intervening with the city on behalf of private restorationists. And so, for instance, the city, there was a law on the books, the Alley Dwelling Act, that was whose purpose is to eliminate alley dwellings, those small houses that front on alleys. But restoration folks started to really enjoy those houses starting in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right, in neighborhoods like Capitol Hill, Foggy Bottom, and Georgetown. And so they were buying them up and restoring them. And in one case in Capitol Hill, folks bought up a bunch right behind the Supreme Court, and the city essentially said, you cannot fix them up, we have to tear them down. And the Evening Star editorialized on behalf of the restorers for weeks, and the city eventually relented, right? And so they are champions of private restoration, right? As are many in the city government. And the people that they're arguing with are essentially major urban planners who are interested in urban renewal, which is just knocking down an entire neighborhood and then rebuilding it. And they say, no, we love this old, quaint city. We just want to seize it from the poor who have blighted these neighborhoods. And then we will essentially kick them out, fix up their houses, and then have the neighborhoods for ourselves, essentially. And so there's two folks arguing here. Both are almost uniformly white. Both are largely affluent. And both are absolutely unconcerned about displacing the poor, right? And one of the ways that they're able to have that conversation without anyone interrupting them is that they literally only mention the original residents of the neighborhood, or at least the ones that are being displaced, in a line or two. Horrible Negro slums. Done, right? Because it's good to get rid of those. Now, the folks on Seton Street knew this history. Many of them were longtime residents of the street, and they had seen what happened in Georgetown. Georgetown is really sort of the original center of gentrification in the district. It's the oldest part of the district. It predates the city by a solid 50 years as a tobacco warehousing port. And by the 1920s, it's in pretty bad shape. It's quite ramshackle. Most well-to-do people are moving away to much nicer housing a little bit further to the east. But Georgetown becomes a place where young folks who are coming to this city for the New Deal, for World War II, and then for a subsequent Cold War, can find these beautiful old houses that they can fix up, that they can be in each other's company. And just by the mid-1930s, it really starts to get a reputation as like a cool neighborhood. A lot of the artists who hang around Eleanor Roosevelt are there living in old alley houses, calling them carriage houses now, right? And so a lot of developers go into Georgetown and specialize in kicking out renters, fixing up these little tiny houses, selling them for a big profit. And Georgetown, by the time you get to the 1950s and 1960s, has well over 700 journalists living on its streets. A couple dozen Congress people, a couple of Supreme Court justices, right? And a president by 1961, right? All living in that neighborhood and really giving a wonderful patina to the process of private revitalization, right? Now, what they also do is make it too expensive for young people who want to live in a gentrified neighborhood as well. So folks start looking just slightly to the east and south, to an old industrial slum called Foggy Bottom. And you can see them through this picture that we're really talking about the waterfront, right? And so this is the area where the Watergate, the Kennedy Center, and then the blocks immediately behind it going up to George Washington Hospital are, right? And it was dominated from the 1850s by these huge gas storage tanks. And those gas storage tanks had tons of alley houses and other smaller houses that looked like alley houses but were on main roads all around them. African Americans, by and large, lived in those houses because it wasn't a particularly desirable neighborhood. And as you move into the 20th century, what you see is that real estate agents essentially push African Americans into this area. This is the western terminus of the Black Belt that looped around downtown, right? And so the areas above Florida Avenue, kind of now that Georgetown is gentrifying across Rock Creek, anything pretty much in what we still think of as a city, but is outside of the old city, is essentially covenanted, right? And African Americans are packed into this area around the downtown, this being on its west side. And developers coming out of Georgetown look at this and say, houses look a lot like some of the alley houses in Georgetown. It's not too far from Georgetown. There's tons of demand for these in-town, quote-unquote, houses. And the gas storage tanks are being torn down. And they're being replaced by luxury apartments and office buildings. And one of them is being replaced by a beautiful performing arts center. We can make some money, right? And they flood in there in the 1950s, and they're literally flipping blocks on a yearly basis. right? Alan Dulles' sister goes in there and starts flipping houses. Amateur flippers are literally turning over 20, 30, 40 houses just by themselves, much less the large private real estate concerns, right? And they're being celebrated by local papers, and so more people are getting in as the word is getting out, right? This is also happening in the 1940s and 50s in Capitol Hill, in the area between 8th Street and the Capitol and the Supreme Court, right? And so when the folks on Seton Street get those letters, they know exactly how this story ends, right? It's a well-worn groove. Everybody understands how this goes down, right? And what's different this time around is that there is a city government for the first time in a century. Remember, Home Rule Charter passed in '74, first Home Rule government seated in January of '75. First thing they do is pass rent control legislation, right? And it gives people sort of the right of first refusal to try and buy their apartment if it's going to be converted to a condo. Doesn't do that for houses, only does that for apartments. So stay with me here, right? Folks on Seton Street say, look, we're not leaving. And so we need essentially a novel legal theory and a little bit of political muscle to be able to stay in our homes. And what Johnny Barnes comes up with is, hey, look at that rent control legislation. We're going to use it, and we're going to try and expand the definition for the right of first refusal from apartment to house, to unit, right? And that poses two problems. One is legal, like will that pass muster? And it probably wouldn't have. It ends up being a moot point. But the other is, okay, if these folks are able to make the legal hurdle, where are they going to get the money to pay for these places? Let me be clear. Seton Street was a dump. Let me be very clear. The city goes in there at the request of these tenants to look at all these houses on the street. And you see how small the street is. It's one block, right? They find just short of 1,000 housing code violations in these houses. Just sort of 1,000, right? You can see from this picture that this gentleman had a leak in his roof that got so bad, the roof literally fell into his tub, right? People were very clear that this was not a nice place. The city was clear that it wasn't a nice place. In 1965, it actually floated a plan to just raise the whole block and move everybody into the projects. That's how, and they were talking specifically about the problems with the physical plant, right? And so what they essentially do, because I'm getting behind, as I can see, is that they go before a judge and they say, look, we want to buy the place, right? They also get the Adams Morgan organization, which begins a political campaign to try and get them to stay. This is actually graffiti put in Adams Morgan by the chairs of the Adams Morgan organization, which you all probably know as the group that gave us ANCs, or at least inspired the ANCs as a concept. Adams Morgan organization was an interracial, community-wide governance structure that residents put together to try and make sure that they could deal with the issues that they were facing. Top among them, gentrification and slum landlords, right? And so they're essentially saying, like, there's a problem on Seton Street and we need to do something about it. At first, their message lands with a thud. Nobody cares. They do fundraisers. They raise about $300. These are fundraisers to help these people buy their houses, right? $300 is not going to help. But then 1978 hits. And the level of gentrification in the city really goes to epic proportions. People are buying whole blocks of row houses in Capitol Hill and just kicking people out. People are buying whole apartment buildings in Adams Morgan and trying to kick out everybody to flip them into condos, right? Because the demand for in-town housing is so high, they realize that they can make a huge amount of money. And in the first truly contested mayoral election in the city's history is happening that year, and people make it an issue in the election, right? And the AMO is out there still beating the bushes, still telling people this is a problem. And so when they're doing fundraisers in 1978, they're raising $20,000, $25,000. And Marion Barry's showing up from the council, and Nadine Winter's showing up from the council, and David Clark is showing up from the council to these fundraisers. So they're getting the political support. Now, what the council does in the midst of all this is pass a raft of legislation that tries to help renters stay in their homes when they're threatened with eviction. And people like David Clark and Nadine Winter, whose two districts are really the centers of gentrification in the city. Winter is over in Ward 6 with Capitol Hill. Clark is over this way with Adams Morgan. And they basically say, look, if anybody buys a house, sits on it, doesn't do anything to it, and then sells it for, essentially flips it for a windfall, we tax their windfall at 90%. It's an anti-flipping tax, right? So they're really doing stuff that's like a little Soviet in order to deal with this issue, right? It's a very exciting moment in the city's history. At the same time this happens, the folks from Center say, this is embarrassing. We're the sort of thin mustachioed evil guy here. We don't want to do this. And so they say, we'll sell the houses. We'll just sell the houses. And those 9 families that stuck through the lawsuit buy their houses. And if you walk up and down Seton Street today, you can find those families and their children, right? They bought them for roughly $18,000 each. And just by 1980, they're worth $100,000 each, right? It's a very exciting story. Now, you'd think that it's sort of done, right? Like, we've sort of beat gentrification. People on Seton Street beat it personally. The city has put together a legal edifice to beat it sort of citywide, right? Then a couple things happen. And by the way, I should point out that Seton Street actually spreads. The ANCs actually take their budget for like making copies and paying a secretary and start hiring housing organizers. And the folks in Adams Morgan at the ANC are flat out, right? We plan to organize the entire neighborhood to get everybody to buy their buildings to form low equity cooperatives. We don't want to have privately owned apartment buildings in Adams Morgan. I mean, this is some bold stuff, right? And by the way, tons of people are able to do that in Adams Morgan. One of the reasons the neighborhood is not more gentrified today is because of those low equity cooperatives that were founded in the 70s and 80s because using this legislation. However, and then it didn't matter anymore because the city kind of goes to pot. Mid-1980s, crack hits the city. It makes it one of the most dangerous in the country. By 1988, we're the murder capital of America, right? And we were able to keep that crown intermittently through the early 1990s. I mean, it's really rough to be a poor person in inner city DC during this time. You had open-air drug markets where people would literally line up on the street next to North Capitol Street. This is Hanover Place, which is right where New York and North Capitol meet. You can see the Capitol down the street, right? And so a lot of those laws that I mentioned a moment ago, they either are no longer enforced in any serious way, because why would you? Like, who's trying to flip houses off of Hanover Place? Nobody. We're good, right? Or they literally expire because some of them were emergency legislation. And so when they're not renewed, they sort of fall off the books, right? But then another demand for housing pops up in the aughts, right? And with a lot of those houses falling out, a lot of those laws falling out of use, all of a sudden, there's not much of an edifice, a legal edifice there for people to fight gentrification. And many of those housing organizers, like the AMO, had demobilized because there wasn't as much use for them. And by the way, people just get tired, right? It's hard to live on the knife's edge year after year after year. And so when there is this huge demand for housing in the aughts, there's really not much to stop that level of displacement that there was that we hadn't seen in about 20 or 30 years. There's still those legal remedies. There's still rent control. But there's not this sort of mobilized community that's using those laws to keep people in their houses. And after the Great Recession, we're getting approximately a couple thousand new residents per month. Right? And so the Washington Post called this the March of the Millennials. It's a huge influx of folks. And what they're doing is pushing poor people out of those old swells of gentrification that are just growing. They're growing in Capitol Hill, they're growing in Adams Morgan, Logan Circle, et cetera. They're also moving into parts of the city that had never seen gentrification before, like Old Anacostia, Deanwood, for goodness sake. Folks are really moving to all parts of the city. And so what you see here is that because white wealth in the aughts was 10 times black wealth, 10 times, in the competition for homes, what you had was wealthy whites essentially replacing poor African Americans. Keep in mind that much of the black middle class is up here, right? So you don't see too much of a turnover in these areas on the edge of Georgia Avenue. Where you see the tremendous turnover is those old swells of gentrification in the middle of the city down here, where the vast majority of the black population that is living there is largely poor and doesn't own their houses and therefore can't push back against this new influx of wealth. Okay, and so I want to return to Seton Street really quickly and end because I'm way over and Chris is probably scowling at me under his mask. And that is that Seton Street does an amazing, the protests on Seton Street do an amazing job of keeping those 9 families in their homes. Again, you can find them on the street today in those specific houses in the picture. What you can't find is their old neighbors. The people who didn't want to fight and potentially lose a lot of money and time and then still get kicked out back in 1978. And what you also can't find on that street is any new working class or poor residents who were able to move in after 1978. And so those people who bought their houses in that one moment of opportunity for $18,000, they're doing well. Those houses were worth $100,000 in 1980. They're probably worth closer to $1 million today, right? But people in those same economic circumstances as the folks who bought those houses in that one moment of opportunity can never get on that street. And in many other neighborhoods around the city have been pushed out, right? So there are wonderful lessons here. The trick is finding ones that are appropriate for this moment, considering the circumstances in which we find ourselves. I'll end it there, and Chris will transition us into the freestyle session.
Thank you, Derek. And just as a building off that last point, it's one of the things that I think it's very hard for Americans to grapple with is the importance of historical opportunity. You know that there's sort of this idea that, oh, you know, if you just work hard and you play by the rules, you do your right thing, everything's fine. Why can't these slacker millennials just build, buy a house like I did when I was whatever? And because circumstances change, right? And in terms of the structure of the American economy, there was a period in the post-World War II era where there was tremendous economic growth and a tremendous creation of wealth. And the people who were shut out then, it's not like you can just go and recreate it now because we live in a very different economy, right? So when you talk about historic wealth and accumulated wealth over generations, you're also talking about wealth that gets created at particular moments in time. And those opportunities, the windows of opportunity close. And once they're closed, it's not like we just reopen them again, right? So we have to understand the generational impact of exclusion at particular points in time. The Seton Street folks, they were the one sliver that were able to create generational wealth because of being able to take advantage at a particular moment in time. But the larger picture is very different.
Yeah.
Anyway, with that, we did want to leave time for things. I know some of you raised questions earlier on, some of which we've gotten to, many of which we did not. But we wanted to open it up again for the last, I'm not sure how much time we have, 15 minutes or so, to just talk about anything that's come up either in the discussions that we've had or things we didn't talk about that you thought would be interesting to raise while we're all in the room or on Zoom together. Yes, in the back.
Thank you.
Can you say something about, I don't know the exact details of this, but there is supposedly a rule that when new housing is developed, there's supposed to be a certain proportion that is for lower income.
Yeah.
And yet I've read that there are ways to get around this. Could you say something about that? Or just,
sure.
I don't know exactly what the guideline is.
Yeah,
but.
No, it's pretty, so the basic idea is that there is legislation that essentially says that if there's a large project that requires a certain amount of city help, you have to reserve 10% of units for low-income people. There's also a way that communities can essentially create deals with developers that force those developers to give them certain concessions, one of which is sometimes lower income housing, right? The administration, the current administration, has attacked the latter and tried to essentially rewrite the comprehensive plan, which is sort of a set of guidelines that governs development in the city, so that it really makes it almost impossible for communities to stop deals until they get those, stop development until they get those deals, right? And there's a guy named Ari Teresa out in Ward 8 who was kind of the lead lawyer in the city who would work with community organizations to strike those deals with developers. And developers would call it blackmail because to a certain degree, it felt like that to them. But what communities called it was, sort of a say in the process, right? They don't have the money, and so to even the playing field, they had some sort of control over the process, at least on saying whether or not it went forward. We have a very pro-development administration right now. And so you have two things that happen there. One is that they're trying to scale back the small amount of say that people already have. And two, you do have a council that will work with developers to get them out of some of the requirements that are already on the books, like that 10% low income. Last thing I'll say is this. The way they calculate low income, moderate income, market rate in the city for development is based on median income. And DC is one of the richest cities in the country. So, we have median income, I believe I want to say it's somewhere between 80 and 120. And so when you're talking about low income, you're talking about something that's around, 60, 70,000 based on the calculation that the council uses for that legislation. Well, okay. Right? Low income in the city, if you look at the actual demographics, you're talking about people that make 30,000, right? And so even when low income units are built sometimes, it's very hard for poor people to get into them. Last thing I'll say is this. Sorry, Chris. A lot of the development that's happening in the city is happening in areas where all the units were occupied by poor people. And they're being built as mixed income. Right? Berry Farms is a perfect example right now. Berry Farms was projects. It was for poor people. It's now being rebuilt as a mixed income community, right? This happened in the Navy Yard. This happened all across the city, right? Whether that's done under Hope 6 or the New Communities Initiative, which are the two major initiatives that have allowed for the building of low-income housing in the city since the 90s. What that typically means is a net loss of low-income units. Because if you have a set number of units that are all low income, and you replace them with a set number of units, only some of which are low income, typically you end up with a smaller number of low income units on the back end. And when you look at what happened at the Ellen Watkins dwellings, which is right over by 395 on the edge of Capitol Hill, what you'll see is that community groups and developers would whittle that number down to almost nothing. And so you'd get essentially a poor community that was erased, and then they put 6 poor people, low income apartments there and say, we did right by you. And so even with all of this protective legislation, folks have found a way to get around it. The only way that people have been able to use this protective legislation in the past is to mobilize. And when I think someone earlier was talking about the decline of membership organizations, right? When you don't have those membership organizations that can mobilize and put pressure on elected officials, the people with more access to power, either people or money, are able to get their way. And that's been people with money.
As an add-in, the old Industrial Areas Foundation organizer Saul Alinsky said, you have organized money, and you have organized people. And if you have developers who have organized money in the form of corporations, and then the only way to counterbalance that power is through organized people. And with the decline of the AMOs of the world and other organized mobilizing organizations, it becomes very difficult to mobilize a counterbalance to the organized power of the corporations. And we saw the same process plays out in urban renewal, sort of the picture book, the textbook example of the destruction of a poor community. The original plans had plans for low-income housing, and with much fanfare, oh yes, don't worry, we won't replace it. It's in the papers. Once they got to building, they turned around. They're like, well, we really can't do that. And the commissioners of the city were just like, okay, don't worry, right? And then that's sort of what happens because the corporations have the power to fight on, right? And it's hard to mobilize people for just extended battles over and over in the courts or at council meetings. People get tired, as we were talking about before, and so it's hard to maintain that power over time.
Yeah. Yes, and go ahead, please.
Where to go? Thank you.
One thing we wondered about in the discussion groups across the street was how much of the history in the book and coming up to today is because it's DC and how much is matched in other cities around the country. And what we thought maybe was that DC, has to deal with Congress, but every city has to deal with the state government. And is that the equivalent?
So I can take that if you want. DC looks a lot like other cities when it comes to this turn towards pro-business leadership in government. And for a lot of these cities, it's because they went broke in the 80s and 90s. I mean, we full on went broke and had Congress imposed a control board, right? And in order to dig out, what DC residents, and this might be the one thing that makes it quite specific to DC, what DC residents had to do was attract well-to-do people back. They had to. Anthony Williams, commissions this report in 2002, and the report concludes, the only way you can raise tax money so that you can balance your budget is if you bring rich people and poor and middle-class people back to the city. And that means building nice new neighborhoods for them. That means building, putting money behind amenities for them. That means giving tax breaks to companies that will attract them. That means essentially shifting public policy towards the needs of middle-class and rich people so that they'll come back, live here, and we can tax their income. Because remember, in DC, unlike some other cities that have more leeway, if you work downtown and you live in PG or MG, we cannot tax your income, right? Congress put a ban on a tax, right? We can't demand that people live here if they work for the government, right? And a huge portion of our bureaucracy lives outside the city. And this happens in Utah and other places too, though, to be fair. About half of the city is non-taxable because it's embassies, federal government, Catholic Church, other churches, right? And so we have a very small tax base, and that's set by policy. One of the ways we get around that and stay in the black, and we've been either, sort of have a balanced budget or getting a pretty significant surplus. We have a, $600,000 surplus this year, come to find out, just announced, is that we invite large numbers of well-to-do people back and structure policy so that they will. What we also did more quietly under the control board is we cut services to the poor. We used to have burial insurance for poor people, right? The city would basically pick up the tab if you died and you were poor here. That was cut by the control board. It's things like that got whittled away, that were part of that sort of effort to make the city more attractive to poor people under, say, Marion Barry and some of the more activist members of the council. Those get whittled away, and then the pivot is towards serving the well-to-do.
Quick follow-up, and then we'll go.
Follow-up, and then, yeah.
The one answer would be when we become a state, we will be able to tax the residents of Montgomery, Prince George's, Northern Virginia.
Right, we'd have reciprocity.
Yes.
2040.
You can take that one, Chris. we always struggle with this one.
And this might be, I'm not sure where we are on time.
So, it is 12:30. Do folks want to just take 2 more questions and then we'll call it at that?
So
Okay.
maybe this might be a good one to end on because our stock line, we're historians. Historians are notoriously terrible at predictions. But I will end, and some of you heard this story when we talked. I told this story in our talk in the sanctuary a couple months ago, which is always beware when you hear people say something is inevitable. Right? You know, people say, "Oh, gentrification is inevitable. There's nothing you can do to stop this or that," and because we tell the story of the highways in this city, and nothing was more inevitable than the highways in the 1950s, because everybody who was anybody who had any shred of power in Congress, in the economy, in the press, everybody loved highways because that was progress. That was the way you went into the future. Was by building these networks of highways to get people in and out of the city quickly. And it had everybody on board. And they started building all these highways. And the money was appropriated by Congress. And the contractors were hired. And the developers were excited. And the press was writing these glowing reports. And people in this city said no. And mind you, they had no power. They didn't matter. They didn't even have a city council to go to, an elected city council to go to. But people in the city said, no, that's not the kind of city we want. We don't want you to pave over our neighborhoods. We don't want you to board up those houses and destroy them. We're going to stand up and we'll fight any which way we can. So maybe we'll get the lawyers to file lawsuits. We'll get the students to chain themselves to a tree. We'll get the homeowners to come out. We're going to band together and we're going to stop these highways. And they did. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know what the city's going to look like in 20 years. I won't hazard to predict that. But I will say that the things that we assume are going to be inevitable probably will not happen, because circumstances are going to change. People are going to stand up in different ways. They're going to fight for the things that they consider worth protecting and saving. And that's part of why we wrote the book. Yeah. We want people to know the history so they can see how complicated it is, how difficult it is to understand, and that there are people with lots of contradictions, and that's okay because that's who we are as well. But there are also these really inspiring stories, whether it's Seton Street or the highways or other people who did stand up for something that was important and helped protect and create the city that we enjoy.
There's a great phrase that stopped the big highway. White men's road through black men's.
Through black men's homes.
Yeah, black men's homes. Yeah.
Sure.
So we are over, and I see Willed standing there. And so I'll just say this to sort of bring it back to the introductory part of our presentation. We love the fact that this is an activist congregation that is looking to history for inspiration and for instruction on how to tackle the issues of the time. And so we think that's exactly how you should use history. History does not do anything in and of itself. Reading it doesn't change the way we act. You want to read it, you want to get inspiration and instruction from it, and then you want to head out into the streets and make a better city, make a better democracy. And so Godspeed as you all do that, and thank you for having us.
Thank you again, Dr. Musgrove and Dr. Ash, for all of your work with us and for the partnership in this ongoing attempt we have to build and become beloved community with one another. We're so grateful.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Also want to offer just a couple of other words of thanks today. You'll see here to my left our tech team. Let's give them a round of applause. Without them, we would not have been able to pull off today. We also want to thank our partners at the Adlavich DC JCC, Sonia Weisberg in particular, who is a co-author of the reading guides that were used by our reading groups. We're so grateful for her and for the work of that whole staff. And we want to thank each of you for participating in this conversation. If we've learned one thing, we've learned that the work of becoming who we're called to be in this city and in this world happens not through legislation alone, but it happens first in the relationships we build with one another. So we hope that you'll continue fostering and nurturing the relationships you've built through the work of the William Astor and Vivian T. Kirk Symposium series, and thank you for being with us today. Take good care.